Welcome to the Tech Talks Daily Podcast, where you can learn and be inspired by real-world examples of how technology is transforming businesses and reshaping industries in a language everyone can understand. Here is your host, Neil C. Hughes.
Welcome back to the Tech Talks Daily Podcast, where every day we learn how technology can change the world for the better. And we're going to do that one podcast episode at a time. And last year, at the start of the pandemic, Accenture Interactive predicted we were entering the start of the virtual century. And that shift towards virtual solutions as a result of COVID-19 would permanently affect the ways of communicating across the way we learn, work, transact and consume. Now, we've now found ourselves almost a year on, and Mark Curtis, Head of Innovation and Thought Leadership at Accenture Interactive, is going to join me on the podcast today to discuss the lasting impacts of this trend and why it is more important than ever before for organisations to work towards streamlining the hurdles of going virtual. So we are going to explore how companies need to look at how they utilise technology to remain viable, connect with their customers, and also create a positive environment for all of their employees. And we will also discuss what's next for the workplace, the innovation of tomorrow, and how organisations can overcome that growing digital disconnect. So buckle up and hold on tight, because it's time for me to beam your ears all the way to London here in the UK, where Mark Curtis is waiting to talk about all this and much more. So a massive warm welcome to the show, Mark. Can you tell the listeners a little about who you are and what you do?
Yeah, sure. So my name is Mark Curtis. I am Head of Innovation and Thought Leadership at Accenture Interactive. And I got here because I started doing digital a long time ago, and my first career was in marketing. And then I got really intrigued by what was happening with technology and the effect that would have on marketing back in 1993, and set up one of London's first web agencies, became a web agency then. And then we sold that to Razorfish in 1998, which was one of the sort of US web agency giants that had developed largely in New York, a bit in San Francisco, some of them. Stayed there for 3 years helping run it globally with my business partner, Mike. And then Mike and I and a guy called Olof Schibergson set up Fjord in the middle of what I call the internet winter in 2001. And Fjord was and is a design agency. We were about 220 people in about 9 cities when Accenture offered to buy us in almost 8 years ago to the day. And we said yes. And so we became part of Accenture. And now I think Fjord's somewhere around 2,000 people, is probably the largest design unit of its kind in the world. So I was Chief Client Officer there, and I've metamorphosed over the last year to running innovation and thought leadership for Interactive in Accenture overall. And I have 5 kids, and I'm sitting in East Sussex right now.
One of the reasons I was excited to get you on the podcast today was back in 2020, at the start of the pandemic, Accenture Interactive predicted that we were entering the start of a virtual century. So can you tell me a little bit more about how you predicted this shift towards virtual solutions and how, as a result of COVID-19, it would permanently affect the ways of communicating and everything across learning, working, transacting and consuming?
I'd love to tell you that we did something super intelligent using artificial intelligence to make that prediction, but we didn't.
Yeah.
It was just common sense.
Yeah.
I think the point we were trying to make, which has absolutely held up, is that we thought we were doing digital and living digital before, since the mid-90s onwards, really, at an accelerating pace. But what happened in March last year was that there was a hockey stick curve upwards. And one of my colleagues in Germany rather brilliantly called this the reversal of the flow. Yeah. And I asked him what he meant. And he said, well, for thousands of years, mankind has gone out to get things. That's why, hunters and gatherers. And more recently, in a more commercial context, we went out to work, to school, to the doctor, to entertainment, to restaurants, to shop, everything really. And all of that, we had to reverse the flow on that at the beginning of the pandemic, because it all had to come to us. And, when we could see what was happening, that we had to figure out digital solutions to reverse that flow of life, it was clear that everything that had gone before were building blocks for the virtual century, but the virtual century really kicked off in 2020.
And I think we've come such a long way in the last 12 months, and we've all debated the benefits, the pros and cons of working from home versus working in the office, to the realization that hybrid working is probably the better approach. And we're now looking at not just working from home, but improving how we can work better anywhere and everywhere. And 1 year later, do you think it's more important than ever that organizations work to streamline the hurdles of going virtual?
I do. I think there are some. I do, and there is no question in my head that hybrid is going to be the future. I was talking to my son-in-law yesterday, and he works in a large, well-known London financial institution, and this is a place which has prided itself in its history on face-to-face meetings. It's a market,
yeah,
and he's in his early 30s. He's got a good career. And he said, I don't think that I'm going to be going back more than 2 or 3 days a week. And he is sensing from his colleagues, who are, presumably an ambitious bunch, he is sensing from his colleagues a reluctance to go back to full time. And that from the bosses of this organization, an acceptance that actually this new hybrid environment is going to be the one that works best for everyone. So I think we're definitely there. One of the number one challenges, I think, is that we're not actually very well set up with our equipment for hybrid work. And, we've hacked together a solution involving something called a laptop for many of us, which, and the name gives it away. It was built for mobility, not for staying in the same place. And cameras, which often are a bit shaky, and audio, which is particularly shaky, though I hope not too shaky on this podcast, and broadband that goes up and down a bit, et cetera, et cetera. I think over the next 2 to 3 years, we're going to see an iPod moment when somebody brings to market a much better combination of software and hardware for remote working, and I think it'll revolutionize how and what we do at home. So I think there's a big opportunity here for technology to lean in a way it hasn't actually quite done yet, and make that hybrid working model way more successful. Cloud clearly is there and is happening, and my cloud expert colleagues tell me that where they believed most organizations were on a 10-year journey to cloud, they believe that's shrunk over the last year to a 3-year journey to cloud. And undoubtedly, cloud is going to be a major enabler of remote working. But I also think that the interfaces and the setups that we use when we are remote are going to have to change as well. That's one challenge.
When we're exploring the future of work and making working from home or working from anywhere better, and what's next for the workplace, how can businesses foster different working environments? Is there any tips or insights you can share on that?
I think when we go to work, we will be going for interaction with other people. So there is no reason to get on a train or get in a car and go somewhere to do email, which you could equally well have done at home. And somebody was talking to me, in fact, he said it last year. He said, I think those day trips or overnight stays in Europe for a 1-2 hour meeting, those are dead. No one's going to do that anymore. So I think we're going to be much more selective about what we choose to go and do. And I think organizations are in fact already doing a lot of thinking about how do we manage the synchronicity of people getting together at the same time in the same place. So there are some logistic challenges there. If I choose always to work at home on Mondays and Fridays, and you choose to work always at home on Tuesdays and Thursdays, that only leaves us Wednesday when we can get together. And if our colleague Rosie is always working from home on Wednesdays, we have a problem. So I think there are some very real logistical and almost HR issues here that need to be tackled about how do we get a consensus and a collective view on when we're there and when we're remote. And then I think in terms of what we do when we're there, I think setting up our workspaces so they are more conducive to collaborative work rather than individual work sitting at a desk on your own. I think that is going to be a major change. And largely, I think we will see some major reorganization of the way in which, at least for office workers, workspaces arrange themselves.
And I think creativity has also been able to shine throughout the pandemic, driven by technology. And it's also acted as almost a catalyst for innovation, where we see everything from TikTok to Microsoft Teams. And we're seeing these platforms creatively repurposed and products increasingly perceived as unfinished tools that can now be adapted in more inclusive designs for much larger audiences. But how do you think businesses can tap into these trends?
I think it requires a mindset shift in two ways. So the first is not to believe that innovation is about creating perfectly polished products, which you take out to market and are then used in exactly the way in which you expected them to be used. What we've learned from the tech industry, and that learning has accelerated over the last year, is that people will take things and then use them in ways which are unexpected. I'm particularly thinking of examples like Joe Biden using the game Animal Crossing to visit voters on their virtual islands. You know, I mean, who would have predicted that maybe 5 or 10 years ago? And indeed, if you look at what the CEO of the games platform Roblox is saying, he's saying some very smart stuff about what he calls the metaverse, which is a new place where things can happen. So my first comment is, don't think of what you're taking out there as being finished. Think about it's okay to take out stuff which is unfinished, where users actually find things to do which give people open-ended solutions where they can actually wrap the technology around their lives rather than the other way around, where we've typically been driving out technology solutions where people have to bend their lives around the technology. I think that's very important. The second one is take a look at these open-ended platforms like Roblox, which I think are doing some very, very interesting things, and try and understand what's happening here, because where they're shifting is to a sense of place. So they're creating places where innovation take place. You could argue that TikTok is in a different way is doing something similar. The third, which is really a sort of maybe a mirror reflection of the first point, is we talk particularly in design about co-creation, and we have done for many years now. What we mean by that is when we're developing something, we go and talk with real customers and they help us build the thing. So we regard co-creation as something that happens at the beginning, at the inception of a project. But what if co-creation was something that happened once you put something out into the market as well, and you then let people build on it? So I think that's a major mindset change in the way in which we think about innovation. And you started with the word creativity, giving customers the tools to get creative for themselves. After all, last year in the UK alone, we saw 50,000 more businesses being created in June, I think, of last year than the year before. So entrepreneurialism in almost every country we look at is going through the roof at the moment. And that, of course, has been a response to the pandemic, as people have had time to think, question their personal purpose, and think, maybe there's something else I could be doing with my life. And I think everyone's super aware of that, because we've all, probably most people, have rolled around in that one themselves. And that's leading to creativity. So innovate to feed that creativity.
It really has. And I love that Roblox example there, and the metaverse. I know Nvidia and Epic Games are all doing similar things, especially as we spend more and more on time communicating. But one thing that we are noticing is the days of leaving the office at 5 p.m. and forgetting about work till the following day, they're also long gone too. And although we're not in meeting rooms, we're now suffering with things like Zoom fatigue, and almost feels like our devices are bombarding us with a variety of notifications, from emails to Slack and any other productivity tools out there. We all know that sound and dread it. But how can businesses overcome those kind of challenges?
Those challenges are so real. And again, I mentioned earlier, we've all rolled around in some stuff over the last year, and that's one. I think there's a number of different ways to think about this. The first is to use data to try and make sure that you become more of an invisible facilitator of what people want to do, rather than an organization that rudely barges into their lives. Like one of my colleagues was talking about it, sometimes with some companies who are, doing stuff to you on digital, it's like being followed around by a persistent fragrance spritzer all day long. Those days are going to have to disappear. And of course, there are some tech moves like what Google and Apple are doing with cookie management at the moment, which I think are going to make it much harder for businesses to do that. I think we will see a shift much more to this thing of what we call invisible facilitation, where you don't necessarily feel you have to be there all the time, but you have to be there at the right moment and provide the help that you need. And I think that the customers need. And I think that requires good use of data. There are some simple examples of that beginning to appear. And I know banks, it's easy to bash banks, but I quite like what some banks are doing, for example, where, this happened to me yesterday. You get a notification on your phone saying, your credit card bill is due for payment tomorrow, and it looks higher than usual. Do you want to, have a look at it? And I think, I can either look at that and go, yeah, it's okay, I'm totally well aware of that because I bought that TV last week, or what's wrong here? I need to go and investigate this a bit more closely. And I think that that's an appropriate use of digital to reach out to the customer and facilitate something in their lives, and done at the appropriate level as well. It's easy to absorb, easy to turn off and get rid of, and actually a helpful service. And of course, underpinning that is data. It's not particularly difficult to do, but they're using data in order to analyze the information that I need. And I think that's one way of doing it. I think the second way of doing it is to understand what belongs in real life and what doesn't. And I think we're at a really interesting point right now in those countries which are emerging from the pandemic because of the vaccine. And I'm very well aware that this is extremely patchy across the world in different places. But understand where people are craving sensual input and real world activity, and make sure that you are in position, even if it involves doing something, which is, to use the common phrase now, pop-up. Make sure you're in position to deliver experiences, sensory experiences where your customers are live. I think that's going to be very important over the next year, because people are going to actually actively be going out and looking for that overload. And I know, for example, and that's proving difficult. I know in some cases, for example, in London right now, there is a massive underpopulation of staff in the hospitality industry, and businesses are really struggling to actually employ the numbers of people they need to meet the demand which they know is coming when lockdown goes through its next wave of lifting. I think the third thing to do is to think about the things which replace in digital some of the things which if we don't think about it, disappear. So what I'm particularly thinking of here is what I call 270-degree peripheral vision. So right now I'm talking to you, I'm looking at a screen, and pretty much most days nothing around me changes. I mean, occasionally a cat wanders past, but I can see the same paintings, the same wall, the same view out of a window. That's not like normal life. When I go to a supermarket and I go shopping, the landscape changes around me all the time. And that patch of yellow I can see over there, I know is cornflakes. And I remember my son asked for cornflakes when I'm in the supermarket. When I go to work and I'm standing there and I see Rosie walking past, and I suddenly think, actually, you know what? Rosie is exactly the person I need to talk to about cloud and that project that I'm working on. So I'm going to grab her attention now. That kind of serendipity doesn't happen when we filter out when that peripheral vision around us becomes immaterial. And that's largely what happens when we're staring at screens all day long, which is why I'm such a believer in looking at what technology can do to try and build some of that back in. Now, we can't completely replicate, and probably shouldn't even want to replicate, real life on digital. But there are some interesting trends emerging, I believe, around businesses trying to do that. And the two things in particular I'd point at, which I think are going on right now, are a trend to live and a trend to place. So I mentioned the place bit a bit earlier on, but Roblox is building this thing which is a place, which the CEO calls the metaverse. If you think about Peloton, it's both a device that you buy at home to get fit, but it's actually psychologically also a place that you go to. I don't have Peloton, but I have something called Zwift, which is an indoor cycling app. So I sit on my indoor cycling trainer and I have a tablet in front of me and I go to this place called Zwift. They've actually given it a name. There's a virtual world called Watopia. So what takes place there is both social and e-commerce, because you can buy things, and health and fitness, because I take exercise there. It's not quite clear to me what it is, but it's definitely a place. And so I think this shift to place is one way in which businesses are responding, or tech is responding. The other one I mentioned is a shift to live. And I think that Clubhouse is a very good example of that. Indeed, what happens with Peloton and Zwift are very good examples of that. You go and take part in events which only take part at that moment, and you either have to be there or you miss. And I'm also really interested by, I don't know whether you've picked this up, Neil, but a new app called Station Head, which allows anybody to create their own radio station. It's one of those ideas where you look at it and you think, why didn't anybody do this before? I haven't actually downloaded it yet, but my first reaction when I read about it was, wow, I'd love to have my own radio station and, like so many people, inflict my choice of music on the wider world. I mean, the reality is it might only be 3 people in my case, but the sort of visceral reaction. Now, what's all that about? It's about live. So I think live and place are 2 things we're beginning to see coming to the fore in digital as we try to find ways to make it more engaging, precisely at a moment when we've spent so much time on it that we're getting disengaged.
Absolutely love that. Completely agree with you, especially on serendipity as well. I think that's so underappreciated and how so much gets sorted in the workplace because of that. But
Teams and Zoom, I mean, they're good. They've it's easy to knock them, but they've been a lifeline for business over the last year. But they don't permit serendipity, or they don't facilitate serendipity, because that water cooler meeting. There is no place in Teams where that happens. And this comes back to the point I made earlier on about the software-hardware combination we have at the moment is not actually brilliantly facilitative of remote working, but it will be, and we're going to see businesses beginning to crack that, whether it's enterprises doing it for themselves or the obvious candidates like Apple or Google.
We've also discussed what the future looks like and how we suspect it's going to be hybrid. And I think we all almost take for granted that Netflix-style experience where we just drift seamlessly and pick up where we left off from almost any device. But of course, IT teams listening, how can they be more agile and help businesses overcome the tech challenges that come with hybrid working and those increasing expectations from employees?
So I think this comes down to a combination of cloud and edge computing. Now, I should confess, I am not an expert on edge. But what I'm hearing from colleagues who are is a pretty compelling case that IT teams need to be thinking about. They certainly need to be thinking about cloud, but also the way in which it's not all about just cloud for everything. There's also stuff that happens at the edge, which facilitates interactions in places where that's actually the best and most user and information friendly and actually technology friendly way of making things happen. I think that the thing to keep in mind with what's happening with cloud is that long term, this is going to democratize access to information and software. And what IT teams need to be thinking about is probably 2 things. Firstly, it's easy to get focused on, building the cloud in order to facilitate hybrid working and other things as well, actually. But actually, this is a pyramid. At the bottom layer, you've got cloud, and cloud in a simplistic way is a place where you put things. so that you can get hold of them. That's essentially what it is. I'm sure there are IT people who would disagree with that, but that's how I see it. The level above this on the pyramid is intelligence, the intelligence layer, and that's where you get to see the things which you've got stored in the cloud and are happening in the cloud, and where you get to make sense of them. So you need to be building that as well. But long term, you're not building the cloud layer and the intelligence layer just for their own benefit. I mean, there are some short-term goals that you can achieve with cloud, like efficiency and cost savings. But long-term, there is a level above that at the top of the pyramid, which is experience. And that experience layer is what you then present to customers and to employees. So I think for IT teams, as you're building out cloud and the intelligence layer, you should, I think, with modern IT teams, be starting out with a vision for what is the experience you're going to deliver at the top of the pyramid to your employees and also to your customers as well. And so I think you have to have that vision in mind. And then you have to be working with this idea that as we increasingly have those layers are going to democratize the ability of different employees to do different things across the organization and to do it at speed. Somebody commented to me the other day that, one of the interesting things about cloud potentially is that a lot of the startups that we lionize have grown their businesses in a digital native way and are used to this idea that information and services flow across the organization, small organizations initially anyway. But actually, the implementation of cloud enables large enterprises to catch up with this. And if the democratization is true, then it actually levels the playing field in favor of large incumbent businesses who should, if they can get the culture right, and that's probably the key point here, then be able to compete more vigorously in the marketplace and faster. So culture becomes, I've kind of spun it back now to when you're talking about IT teams, they're going to have to grapple with culture, because when you look at the remote worker or the hybrid worker, it's not just about building those layers I talked about. It's also about engaging with them and teaching them to use these new tools.
And I'm curious, as someone that's working right in the heart of the industry, surrounded by so many fascinating insights, is there anything in particular that stands out and excites you about the road ahead and where we're all going?
Yeah, there's two things, I think. For me, the number one thing now is sustainability.
Yeah.
There's a very simple logic to this. We've got to fix the problem. And it's everyone's problem. And I don't think in 2 or 3 years' time, we will be looking at any problem without considering the sustainability aspect of it. I believe that at the consumer level, we have a growing generation of consumers who are beginning to look at products and ask awkward questions about how is this made and where did it come from and is this sustainable? And we're going to have to effectively redesign everything around, and I mean everything, not just cars and power plants, but desks and deodorant, the whole lot around sustainability. And that, I think, is both of course it's frightening, but it's also a massive opportunity and a challenge we just have to rise to. So that at a personal level is preoccupying me, but I believe that everybody will be on that. We'll be there, pretty soon, actually.
Now, you did mention Station Head a few moments ago, so I know you're a music guy, and a question I always like to ask my guests is there a particular song that has inspired you in the past, helped you in your career, or helped you get on your head in the zone before going on stage, or just reminds you of the world of tech? What would your song be and why?
There is, I mean, there are so many that it's very, very hard to pick, but because of my age and background, it would probably need to be something from the Clash, or the Sex Pistols, or the Damned, around about 1976, 77. And I'm not sure I can pin it down to any one, but if I want to lift my energy levels, then any of those would do it. Along maybe with Johnny Be Good by Chuck Berry, which just still makes the hairs stand up on the back of my neck every time I hear it.
Great choices there. Before I let you go, though, but for anyone listening that would like to find out any information about anything we've talked about today, the topics we've covered, maybe the report, and how they can contact your team at Accenture, what's the best way of doing that?
Yeah, so you can find me on LinkedIn, I think pretty easily. Just Mark Curtis and Accenture, those words should bring me up. You can email me. My address is mark.curtis@accenture.com. And of course, you can go and have a look at Accenture Interactive's website as well, which is you can find through accenture.com.
Excellent. Well, there's so much I loved about chatting with you today. In particular, the points there about Zoom and Teams not being able to create serendipity in the office, but also exploring how companies need to look at how they utilize technology to remain viable, connect with their customers, and also just create a positive environment for their employees. Covered a lot of ground in a short amount of time, but more than anything, just thank you for sharing it with me today.
Oh, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure to be here.
Wow, there was just so much gold in there from Mark, from what's next for the workplace and how there is no such thing as an old normal anymore, just old processes and technology. And regardless of what the future workplace looks like, the value of being physically present has been forever diminished. And that's why businesses need to take a holistic approach to acknowledging how alterations across talent acquisition, control and technology can influence and foster different working environments remotely. And also how organisations can overcome the growing digital disconnect and why businesses must create new people-focused digital workplaces and adjust to how they can convey and use technology. And although technology has engulfed the workplace, it's very much human emotions now, such as empathy and compassion towards employees is leading the way, because especially as more and more people are feeling excluded digitally. So a big thank you to Mark for discussing how the notion of empathy, for example, is crucial to the design of new systems and the implementations of new technologies. And like I always say, technology works best when it brings people together, and everything Mark discussed today is a great example of that. So a big thank you to Mark for sharing his insights on the podcast today. But this is the moment where I turn the microphone over to you, invite you to share your insights and experiences. Any questions you may have, or even pitches to come on the podcast. I always invite anyone listening to come on here and share your opinions too. So please email me, techblogwriter@outlook.com. My website is techblogwriter.co.uk. And you can get me on LinkedIn, Twitter, etc. at Neil C. Hughes. So I'm interested in what takeaways you had from today's episode. I look forward to hearing from you all. If not, don't worry, I will return again tomorrow with another topic. And we'll continue to learn how technology is changing the world for the better, one podcast episode at a time. So a big thank you for listening as always. And until next time, don't be a stranger.
Thank you for listening to the Tech Talks Daily Podcast with Neil C. Hughes. Remember, technology works best when it brings people together.